Hey guys, Bassmaster Elite Series Pro Kyle Monty here on Lake Okeechobee today. Going to show you guys how to flip and pitch post-front conditions today. It's a really good technique if you're coming down to Florida and you're looking to catch some of these pre-spawn largemouth out of some thick cover. We're going to show you guys how to do that today. So what I start with is just a regular punch rig is what we call it. And you're going to have a bobber stop that's going to go on your line. When you get these things, a lot of guys have trouble figuring out how they work. There's a little loop just above the bobber stop that you're going to slide your line in. And this is 65-pound P-line TXP braid. It goes on just like that. Wet it a little bit so it slides up. This is a 1.5 ounce flat out tungsten. I go with a flat out because they don't chip and they don't have any sharp edges on the inside. That's really important. You say 65-pound braid, you think, you know, it takes a lot to cut that line, but sometimes a lot of the manufacturers on the cheaper tungsten on the inside will have sharp edges. So if you're experiencing, you know, any type of cut on your line when you're setting the hook or you're hanging up and it's cutting that line, that's most likely just your weight, guys. And I use the flat out personally because you don't have that issue, but if you wanted to go with a different type of weight, just keep that in mind when you're using it. For me, it's always this straight shank style flipping hook with a good keeper on it. You know, some people like to create their own keeper by tying, this is about 80-pound mono, but these hooks are, I believe these are Mustad. They come just like this, but I always snell the knot. And that's really important, guys. I'll show you why. Show you how to tie the knot. You take the hook, have it bent up towards you, so facing you and up. That's how you know which way to go in. If you tie it like this, the hook's going to kick backwards once the weight hits it. So I like to go through, this is going to be really difficult. Let me shaking. Go through here, make your loop, just like that. And all we're doing is taking this tag in, around the hook and through the loop 5 to 6 times. If you can see that. Right there. Do it once. Old timers used to do it for saltwater fishing. They don't do that anymore apparently. Right here. You're going to end up with something that looks like this. Okay? So this knot needs to end up being in between your keeper and the eye of the hook. So I just take it all, slide it up. Doesn't matter if it gets out of whack because it's all going to be bundled up at the end here. All right, so now everything's up and above. We're just going to pull tension on here, wet it a little bit. It does not have to be pretty, guys. This knot is not pretty. That's what it looks like when it's finished. Trim the tag end up. And the purpose of that, when you're using that big weight, you're going to take your bobber stop, slide it back down to keep the weight from moving. You know, I'm going to end up putting the bobber stop all the way up against the tip of the hook. But the purpose of that is when that fish bites it, it's going to actually kick that hook up into the fish's mouth, because this big of a weight for bass fishing, typically when a bass hits it, he's going to have the entire thing in his mouth. And if you snatch really hard on this setup, you know, it's going to, with a regular knot, it's going to pull straight this way and it's going to blow that fish's mouth open. Whereas with the snell, you could just kind of pull into the fish and it's going to kick the knot or kick the hook up into the fish's mouth. And that way your hook sets are going to be a lot easier. So like I said, you're going to take it, put it all the way down, trim up the tag. Now, if you're asking yourself, did I tie it right? That's the test at the end. If it kicks the opposite way, if your hook kicks out this way, that means from the beginning, you didn't come in with the hook up towards you. You came in the opposite. You didn't come in with the hook facing toward you. You came in with the hook upside down. That would create the kick to go backwards. Yeah. I keep it pretty simple with bait selection. You know, a beaver style bait's always a good way to start out. Something that has appendages but not a lot of flap, not a lot of movement. If it's post front conditions, typically bass are going to want something a little more subtle. Meaning if you put your bait in the water on the weight and it's flapping around like crazy, a lot of times that's a little bit too much when it's post front. Black and blue, anything black and blue in Florida is the #1 color. I keep it pretty simple with those for flipping baits. Black and blues, June bugs, and you know, if the water's cleaner than what it is here, we'll go with green pumpkin, watermelon colors. But when the water's dark like it is, stay dark on your baits, guys. Don't get too caught up in the color of the bait. Now for rigging this, what I tell people is look at the gap between the keeper and the tip of the eye, and that's going to tell you how far to go in initially. Because what you want is that bait to be nice and straight at the end, but you also want it to cover the eye of the hook, just like that. Make sure the keeper is exposed. Take your weight, bobber stop all the way down. And now, on certain rigs, you would tell people, you know, you see a lot of bass fishermen rig their baits where the hook is exposed just a little bit, or you expose it then bring it back through. On this particular application, guys, we're going to leave it right in the middle of the bait, because with the snell knot kicking up and with, you know, a really sharp 3/0 hook, it's going to come through that bait no problem. And that's it. That's the setup for today, guys. Just regular punch rig. Pretty common. If you guys want to give it a try, when you come down to Florida, this is what we're looking for though. We're looking for this type of cover here where it's going to have a canopy blown into standing cover. So in this case it's cattails with pennywort and some chopped up cattails laid over, and that's going to create like a canopy underneath that stuff. It looks like it's really thick, but underneath that stuff is actually hollow. And when the skies are really bright and sunny and the pressure's really high, those fish will tuck up underneath that stuff, and you really got to get into them. You know, later in the year when it starts warming up, they'll come out into these pads and into this open water, but right now they're going to be buried up in there waiting for spawn time to start. So we're going to go after them and see if we can get a couple. So the main thing that I see people mess up when they're punching is they don't get the bait falling downward on the cast. So the presentation on the really thick stuff, and it's not going to go down every time, but the ideal situation is that you could get it in and out more efficiently than the next guy, and that's gonna get you more bites. Because if you make 10 flips and only 2 of them get in, the guy that's getting in 5 or 6 times is obviously going to have more chances. So what I do is I get the bait going up and I'll kind of stop it just a little bit, and that's going to allow it to punch right through that stuff. So now I'm down through it, and if you notice, I'm maintaining contact with the bait the entire time. If you just throw that thing in there and let your line go slack, that weight is heavy enough to where the fish could feel it and actually let it go. So you really want to maintain contact once it breaks through. And on a high pressure day like today, I might jig it in there 3 or 4 or 5 times just to try to get that fish to react to it. When it comes out, I'm making sure there's no mud, no grass on the bait before I make the next presentation. Like in this case right here where it doesn't go through, you can just shake the rod tip sometimes, just small shakes like that right there, and it slides right in. Nice and quiet. A lot of times when the bottom has mud on it like this does right here, I don't want that bait to actually go all the way to the bottom. Most of the time the fish are going to be suspended directly underneath that mat. So you want your bait to be, you know, from the bottom of the mat, maybe a foot down most of the time is where most of your bites are going to come. Bow positioning is really important on this. You're obviously not going to be more than, you know, 15, 20 yards away from your target. So having your trolling motor down low, moving at a nice slow pace is really important. You know, the water depth here is only about 2.5 feet. So being really stealthy with your presentation, and not expected to get, you know, this isn't a technique where you're going to go catch 100 fish a day. This is a technique where you're going to get the bites that matter in a tournament, or if you're coming down to catch a trophy size largemouth in Florida, this is what you're doing. You know, you're not after 100 bites. So don't get discouraged if you do this for 2 or 3 hours and don't experience any type of success. You know, it might just be the timing. You know, on a really good day, I say if you could get a bite every 20, 30 minutes, that's pretty good doing this right here, because it's so specific. Like that right there, that's what you're gonna pick up a lot of times on the way back with that heavy weight. Another thing to pay attention to, guys, when you're pitching this thing around, especially if it's 2, 3 foot deep, you know, once that thing goes through, it's pretty quick to the bottom. You wanna be in a position with your rod and your reel in order to get that fish out. You know, as soon as you feel the bite, you're gonna set the hook with this. It's not like you're fishing a regular soft plastic worm where you're gonna let the fish eat the bait. You know, when you're Texas rigging a normal worm, casting it around, you wanna wait 2 or 3 seconds before you set the hook when you get a bite. But with this presentation, you wanna wrap it around the tip real good. But it's really important, guys, to keep your line tight throughout this presentation and be ready quick. You know, a lot of guys are going to left-handed reels because they like to flip with their right hand, and that allows them to keep their left hand on the reel the entire time. I prefer to switch back and forth throughout the day, just because if you do this for hours and hours and hours, it starts to weigh on your shoulders a little bit. This is a 711 Denali Lithium Series rod, so it's a long rod. It's almost 8 feet long. And with 1.5 ounce weight, especially if you're not used to this, you're gonna start feeling tension in your shoulders. So I like to switch it up throughout the day. I'll go right and left, but if you notice, before that bait goes down into the water, I'm in this position here, just above 9 o'clock. You never wanna end up being up here, and you never wanna end up pointing straight at the bait, because then you're gonna lose your feel and you're gonna lose your leverage. In this video today, guys, it's more about teaching you the technique rather than you watching us catch fish today. But the conditions are really tough, but this is exactly what I would do under these conditions, just because I know it's gonna be a tough day, and I know these fish are gonna be tight to the cover, and I know it's gonna be slow. So this allows me to cover every little spot rather than sitting out here casting a worm or a spitter bait out off the edge. This allows me to get the bait right to the fish all day. Every time I pitch that thing in there, I think I'm right in front of one, whether he bites it or not. You know, that's based on the day. Sometimes you go through a stretch like this and you don't have any bites, and it's just a matter of timing. You'll come back through in an hour or two, and then you'll get 2 or 3 bites. So don't get discouraged if you're not getting a lot of bites right off the bat. I'm not gonna get discouraged if we go 2 or 3 hours without a bite, just because I know this is the right presentation. You see some dead stuff in there like that? A lot of times that dead brown vegetation is gonna hold heat for these fish. You know, it's not too cold today. The water's not too cold, but if it's dead of winter, a couple major cold fronts come through, that's something to look at and say, you know, a lot of guys will look at that and say, well, it's dead, it's no good, but that's not true. The dead stuff actually holds heat when it's cold out, and those fish will get right underneath it. Now this is primarily a Florida technique. I mean, you'll come across some lakes outside the country that have matted vegetation, but it's not the same as what you see here. It's typically, when you run into it outside of Florida, it's going to be just a canopy of like hydrilla, submerged vegetation that grows to the surface. And that's going to be, you know, your later in the fall type bite. That's going to be a fall type later in the year. Whereas in Florida, this is going to be your pre-spawn, October, November, December. situation when the fish are coming in from the outside to stage up to spawn. So if you find this type of stuff in Florida, a couple things that I'll look for outside of just the cover itself is where is it at? You know, this is an area that I know the fish are going to spawn in, and that's really key if you're trying to target the big groups of fish that come into the, you know, to the areas to spawn. They're looking for the first bit of cover they can find to kind of hunker down and make their home until that water temp warms up, and then they'll slide right out here and spawn, and then they're gone. You know, they're back out in the open water where you're using more summer tide patterns out in the open. But we're trying to find that first group of fish that's moved in, stage it up, getting ready to spawn. That's another unique thing about Florida, especially Lake Okeechobee. We have one of the longest spawns in the country. You know, these fish have already started. Matter of fact, you can see it right there. You can see that little group of fry right there, just on the edge of the mat, where some fish have already spawned. You know, those fry have hatched out just recently. They're really small, but you'll have different groups of fish coming in throughout the year where they'll spawn from October through April and May. I've seen them spawning. You know, and some guys claim that they spawn year round here, but when you go to other lakes outside of Florida, you know, your spawn window is going to be a week, maybe 2 weeks, in April or May around a full or new moon. But here there's just so many fish, and the water tip stays just right for such a long period of time that they could spawn for 5 or 6 months here. I like what you see. This is pennywort right here, where you see the round leaves, kind of like a bulb on it, where you have water hyacinth, which is right here, kind of that brown, taller stuff. Ideally, I like to have water hyacinth more, but given the circumstances this year, there's not a lot of that around. You know, there's FWC manages the lake, and you know, water hyacinth is considered an invasive non-native species. So as it grows, they spray it and kill it, whereas the pennywort is a native species. You know, either way, the main focus is to have a canopy, you know, where underneath this is actually hollow. So if it's 2 foot of water here, it's still 2 foot of water underneath that. The actual depth doesn't change until you get back to that wall where you see it really thick. That's where your depth is going to start changing. So at first glance, people are going to look at this and say, man, you just throw it up there in almost on the bank, where it's actually just as deep there as it is out here. But that gives them shelter, that gives them a home, that gives them a canopy to live under and feel comfortable, because under post-front conditions, bass, as a general rule, want to hunker down, whether that's deep water or heavy cover. You know, they're going to want to hunker down and not move a lot, not feed a lot. That's why when I'm going to jig this thing 3, 4, 5 times in here. Now, if it's a day where, you know, you're getting bit as soon as it goes in, you don't have to jig it that many times. Just take your bait, let it go in, you know, up and down 2 or 3 times and then back out. When you're starting out, the motion, how I explain it to people, is I like to get the bait above the reel, but not more than a foot or 2. You know, that's going to allow it to swing back to your hand. I'm not grabbing the bait, and a lot of times I see people making a mistake. They are actually throwing the bait, you know, because they see people doing it. You're not actually throwing this bait. You could take just right above the bait like this if you didn't feel comfortable grabbing it with a hook in it, and all I'm doing is dropping it. And as that bait starts to come back up, I'm going to lift the rod and let my thumb off the spool. That's the most important part, is getting it on the upswing. The second most important part is stopping it with your thumb once it actually makes contact. That's gonna keep you from getting any type of overspin in your bait caster. So you're dropping the bait. You know, if you're right-handed, start with the rod in your right hand. It's gonna be more comfortable. As you progress, you could do it without grabbing the bait. You could just swing it, but it's the same motion. Down and up. But for starters, hold above the line. Don't take your rod, don't drop the bait straight in line with your rod. Start out off to the side a little bit more. That way you could lift it up with an 8-foot rod. It's really, really hard to do just straight. I like to start it off to the side. And don't throw the bait. We're not throwing the bait, we're dropping the bait. And as it comes up, we're letting it go. The thicker the grass, the higher you could go up. Sometimes, you know, you have to go up here 8, 9 feet in the air to get that bait to go down. And even then it didn't go down. So it's a matter of feel of what you're doing. See, our hook popped out there. Every time I'm bringing it back, I'm taking a quick peek at the bait, making sure the hook isn't out backwards, out of the front of the bait, or there's no grass on it. We don't want any grass or mud on our bait going in. If you look, the bottom here has got that silt as you kick it up, and that's the main reason why when it goes in, I really don't want it to go all the way to the bottom, because it's just gonna, that 1.5 ounce weight is gonna get buried in that stuff, and now you're making the right presentation, but if there's stuff on your bait, a lot of times that fish isn't even gonna give it a look. Here's a little guy. Now see, with that knot that's on there, gets them right in the very roof of the mouth. That's what that snail knot's gonna do, guys. It's gonna kick it up for you. And that's just about an average size fish, you know, probably a little male. We're looking for his female companion. That's a good sign though. We've been doing it for about 20 minutes and got a bite, so. Put the power poles down, re-rig. Now with that, you know, I see a common mistake made, you know, people were, because baits are expensive. I mean, let's be honest. People were trying to get the most out of their baits, but in this application, guys, if that bait is not able to sit up above the keeper and your hook's not able to stay in it, it's time for a new one. And in this case, I know it is, just from experience where it's torn. If you're trying to reuse it and you know, every other flip the hook's popping out, that typically means it's time for a new bait. So we're gonna get a new one and get back in there. Yeah, so I'll show you. Like you asked what the difference was, like the actual cover. If you look at the water hyacinth here versus the pennywort, see if I give you an example. The water hyacinth has these root systems on it that will hold, you know, shrimp and krill and stuff like that, versus pennywort, which is basically just growing like yard grass. It's growing in an actual piece of mud that's floating, you know, that's not, they don't have that root system. You see right here, there's some more fry right there. Fry and bait fish and shrimp, it all like to hang out right at the roots of those. And so you have a couple different types. You have a water hyacinth, which has got the bulb on it, versus water lettuce. You know, both have the same root system though. And what I look for a lot of times is either, you know, a combination of the two where the two meet, like right here, or if it's just a perfectly round, you know, about the size of a 55-gallon drum, like one little specific spot like that seems to be the higher percentage areas, because that fish will be locked down right in that one spot instead of a mass of it. You know, sometimes you go to places where it's just 15, 20 foot wide, and it's like, where do you even start? This is a good place for me to start, because it's got good mix of the grass and it's got small amounts of it. It's not overwhelming. But you notice that pennywort stuff grows more up on the, you know, where this mud is. Like right here, that's just solid mud on that, and you can't get a bait down through that. But whereas right there where that lettuce is, you could get your bait down through, and I'm down and in. You know, I'm looking for, I call those soft spots. You know, it's anywhere else right there, you're not going to be able to get your bait down except for right there, because I know that water lettuce isn't growing in mud. It's growing, you know, it's got its own root system that supports itself that way. You know, this is a soft spot right here where you can see a little bit of water. But I like it to be nice and isolated. See how that's got a nice, almost a round profile to it? Heads up. Oh, he ate it. Let it go. That's typical. High pressure, they're just gonna hit it on the way in, and he's not eating it because he's hungry, he's just eating it out of a reaction. So if that happens, a lot of times I'll put the power poles down and make multiple flips back to it. You know, if you flip in there 3 or 4 more times without a bite, just mark that area. I'll take and mark on your Lowrance and come back to it. You know, come back to that actual spot. You could put it in your graph if you're having a hard time remembering what it is. You could actually put notes in with these new graphs and say, you know, round water hyacinth towards the back. But I would know just based on the area where it was at from doing it so much. He hit it as soon as it went through, so he was right up against the bottom side of it. Most likely, he's not going to come back. It's always worth a couple more flips, so. Oh, that was a little guy. He hammered it though. Let's see if we have any marks on there. Nope. Sometimes you can look at your bait and tell how they're grabbing it where it's marked up, but I pulled it away from him so fast. Never got it. Not in yet. Still not in. Nope. Oh, the fry right here. They've already spawned in here once. That's where going really slow makes a difference. You know, if you're up close to the cover like this, and the other thing is I'm not hitting anything with the trolling motor out here. Sometimes you're in a situation where there's grass and pads out off of this area, and as you chop through that stuff, yeah, it does spook them for sure. In that case, I would turn it around and go with the wind and use the trolling motor only, you know, sparingly, and let the wind take you at a pace. Use your power poles. But in this case, you know, it's early in the year. These fish haven't been messed with too much, so they're not as spooky. Now, as the year progresses and you start seeing more and more boats fish through areas like this, and you know you're getting pressured fish, that's where downsizing your baits and being even slower with the trolling motor. You know, I've got it on 4 out of 10 right now, and I'm barely using. I definitely don't want to hit that stuff with the trolling motor, and I don't want the trolling motor to wash that way, if that makes sense. You know, if you kick it to the left really hard and it washes that out, a lot of times that's where you'll spook them. But if you're out, you know, 10 yards like this, 8 yards, whatever it is, a lot of times that fish is in there because he doesn't want to move around a lot. He's hunkered down. He's just waiting for the conditions to get right. So for him to leave that, it takes quite a bit, you know, of trolling motor noise. Or, you know, if you come through here 5 or 6 times in a day and you catch, you know, a fish on every pass, then they'll start catching on to you a little bit and say, all right, maybe we should move. But for the most part, if you're nice and slow and stealthy like this, get your bait in every little spot that you can, that's going to be the most productive method. I've noticed the places where we've gotten bites have been everywhere we've seen that fry. So typically what happens with a bass, the male will come in to make the nest and spawn. He'll make the nest, sweep it out, and then the female comes in, lays the eggs, and leaves basically. So after the eggs are fertilized and they hatch out, the male will stay with those fry until they get, you know, a little bit bigger, you know, an inch long or so. But he'll hang around those fry and guard them. And those are some of the easiest fish to catch, the ones that are guarding those fry, because they're really aggressive, they're really protective over them. And I think that's what's happening here. We're just getting the males that are guarding those fry the last couple bites that we've had. What we're looking for is a female that is coming in for round 2 of the spawn when the moon gets right here. But everything's lining up right. Now it's just about getting in the right area. For me, you know, conditions-wise, as far as moon phase, and you know, when you're talking about fish that are spawning or trying to spawn, pre-spawn, it's all based around the moon. Typically, the fish are going to spawn around a new moon or a full moon, and they'll start moving in, you know, 3 to 5 days before those events. So if you have a full moon on Saturday, 3 days before that is typically my favorite. You know, 3 to 5 days before. On the full moon, if you're not catching fish that are actually spawning, which these aren't, these are fish that are staging, you know, you're looking at, I just had a bite, sorry. You're looking at, you know, really tough conditions on a full moon, because those fish will feed at night, and it just puts them in a funk a lot of times. You know, as a guide on the lake, we do a lot of shiner trips too, and I see it even with shiners. And for the most part, when you're shiner fishing or doing this right here, you're trying to target fish that are pre-spawn. So my answer to that would be, if you're looking for the right conditions for bass fishing, pre-spawn or spawn, it's 3 to 5 days before the full moon or new moon for me. But knowing that, you know, you can still catch fish on the full moon or on the backside of the full moon like we are, but I just know that it's going to be a little bit slower. You know, knowing that going into the day really helps you make your decisions. It allows you to, you know, to guess if the fish are going to be biting kind of funny, or if you need to slow down more. Whereas if you're, there you go, a little better. Now see there, I don't know if you could cut back to the other fish, but if you look at the difference between the two fish, once again, he's hooked right in the roof of the mouth. That's the snell knot. The difference between the two fish, obviously a little bit bigger, but this one is white. This one is really, really white and pretty, meaning he probably just moved in here. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for those fish that first come in, because I'm gonna get him back in the water. As a general rule, in Florida, you know, if a fish is what we call a resident fish, you'll have fish that live in this stuff year round. And most of the time they're the smaller fish, like what we caught. The first fish was, you know, 10, 12 inches, and he was really dark. That doesn't tell me anything other than we got a bite. That one tells me that, you know, there's a potential for more fish to be behind them, with them, grouped up. Because the fish that come in from the lake are typically in groups, versus, you know, your random fish here and there. They're going to be darker. They're going to be what we call resident fish. So that one right there gives me more hope for the rest of the day. And we're closer to the lake here too. To jig it or anything, he was just on it. That's another good sign. If you're having to jig that thing up and down 3, 4, 5 times, that typically means they are very, very picky that day. This, because there's nothing that looks really enticing to me there. Another key thing when you're fishing mats like this is to find the ones that look like they've been, you know, obviously if you can't be out on the body of water every day to know which ones have been here longer, look for the ones like this where they're actually growing back into the vertical cover, the cattails, whereas sometimes you'll find them that, you know, it looks good but it just blew in. You know, if that piece of cover just got there, a lot of times the fish are going to want to find the stuff that's been there for a long period of time. You know, at least, when I say a long period of time, at least a month. You know, something that's locked in, that's not moving, that they're used to coming in and out of, just like you would at your neighbor's house or your friend's house. If you know that house is there, you're going to go there. Whereas if you lived in a camper and it could move, you know, you're not going to have the confidence that you did. Okay, where is it going to be this week? So the fish are the same way. They want to have a home that is secure, and that's exactly why they're underneath this stuff in the first place, is because it's some security for them. If you look, there's absolutely no clouds in the sky, high pressure. Any type of fishing you do, you know that that's going to be tough conditions. So they're going to hunker down, and this is what they're going to hunker down in. Here's an example right here, what we're talking about. That's what we just caught those fish out of. That's hyacint. But that hyacint to me, since it's on the very outside, looks like it just got there. You know, you could easily just push that and it would go, versus the stuff that's in the back, which have, you know, that's where I'm going to make my flip, to the back where it looks like it's locked in there, where it's been there for a while, versus stuff that just blew in. This stuff moves around with the wind changing directions and stuff too, you know. Today it's out of the north. There's a bite. Oh, hit it right at the top. Stole my cricket. So now that the cover that we're targeting, the hyacinth and the pennywort's kind of going away, we'll make a move, get on another stretch. All right. Stage up underneath this stuff longer than what they do afterwards, but they'll stage up underneath this stuff, spawn, and then sometimes they'll hang around for a little bit, kind of recover, and then they're right back out, and then it's over. You know, once you think the spawn is over with, for the most part, you know, I'm not catching spawning fish, but I'm catching fish that are staging to spawn or recovering from a spawn. But recognizing that a spawn is going on is important too, because, you know, after this water temperature starts warming back up and they go, you know, the majority of the fish go to spawn, that's what you need to be doing. You need to be targeting, you know, your areas that you think they're actually going to be nesting in versus where they're staging. But since it's early in the year, obviously we've had some spawn because we've seen some fry already, but, you know, we're looking for those, what they refer to them as waves of fish that come in groups. You'll have random fish spawn here and there, even without the conditions being right, even without the moon being right. As long as that water temp's close, you'll have some trying. But we're looking for the big groups, you know. What is the big group of fish doing? Oh, that was a big one, dude. I'm sitting here talking, that was a big one. Oh man, that wasn't a tap. Meaning, the last few bites we got when we flipped it in there, the smaller fish will typically tap. You know, you'll feel a thump. That one, a bigger fish like that, when you flip it in, most of the time you might feel one thump, but you're just gonna pick it up and it's gonna be heavy. And that's what happened there. That's why it's important to maintain that contact with your line. See how my line stays tight the entire time? I'm not dropping that weight down slack, because if that fish hits it and it's slack, a lot of times he's just gonna spit it right back out and you'll never even know it. My very first pickup, typically what I'm telling myself is, I'm not trying to jig the bait. I'm just picking it up to see if there's one on it. Because as soon as you go to jig it and he's got it in his mouth, he's gonna feel it and he's gonna let it go. That one I was just too late on the hook set. All there was to it. That was a good one. It's a good sign though. This water over here is a little cleaner than that other side. You know, I looked down in the water. If you could see your bait, you know, 1.5 foot down, that's typically clean enough to catch them flipping. If it's really, really crystal clear, I actually don't like this presentation as much. I'll go to your natural color baits, your green pumpkins, watermelon reds in that case, but you always want a little bit of a stain when you're doing this. And as a general rule in Florida, you're going to have a little bit of stain to the water. But if you go to a lake, like a private lake or a phosphate pit or something where the water you can see 10, 12 foot down, you're going to need to find deeper mats, deeper, here it's all relative. If you're in 2.5, 3 foot of water with 1 foot of visibility, that's pretty good. But if you're in 20 foot of water with 1 foot of visibility, that's not good. It's all relative based on the body of water. But in general, across the board in Florida, you're going to be punching less than 8 foot of water, and you're gonna have anywhere from 0 inches of visibility to 3 feet, all of which are fine for this technique. But just remember that the cleaner the water, that's when you want to go with your natural colors. When it's dark, dark baits, which is kind of contrary to the common belief, of the average fisherman thinks, well, if the water's dark, you need a brighter color bait. But a bass typically sees, just the profile, just a silhouette more than anything. So by you having a dark color bait, it's gonna be, bright skies. He's just seeing a shadow, really. He's not looking at that thing really close, because it's going in and it's coming right back out. I've always said, if he's smart enough to count the speckles in the bait, then he's smarter than me, so I don't want to catch him. Bass fishermen tend to get caught up in stuff like that, man. I mean, I've had guys come in that want June bug color worms, and all we have is a June bug color worm with red flakes in it, and they'll say, oh no, they won't hit that. It's not true, they'll hit it. It's more of just getting the shade of the color right. And for me, that's either a dark color, black, blue June bug, or something natural, greens, browns. The area is the most important thing, the area and your presentation. Now this is a prime example of how the different types of grasses meet. You have regular hyacinth, then you have some brown hyacinth that has been sprayed, and then it goes back into the pennywort. So what I'll try to do is get my bait right on the edge of the two, right where the two meet. And a lot of times, that's your high percentage area there. Being able to read the grass is probably the most important thing when you're doing this, because to the average person, it's going to look pretty much all the same. So being able to pick out the little differences like that is what's going to allow you to, put your bait in the right spot. So pay attention, if you're going down your, here or your local lake and you get a bite in a certain type of grass, take note. Was it in brown stuff? Was it in green stuff? Was it in pennywort, hyacinth, lettuce? How deep was it? And then you'll start to build your pattern for the day. Every day is different, but for the day, if you catch 1 or 2 in a certain type of cover, typically, that's what you're going to be most successful in that day. Here it's really shallow too. Wish I had a little bit more water under it, but see, the lake's dropping right now. It's dropped almost a foot in the last 2 weeks. See how this is kind of just a big mass of it here? Like we were talking about earlier, how I like the isolated clumps better. Sometimes when you get in a big long stretch of it like this, there's fish in it, but being able to pinpoint them is a little harder. Like I would rather go after this right here, where it's by itself.
Like a little island.
Yeah, you're looking for an isolated, a place that fish can make his home. Now there's fish underneath that, but it's a lot harder to get it right in front of them. And this technique is basically you're putting it right in front of them. You know they don't want to eat, but when you get it right in front of them, it triggers a bite. A bass is a lot like a really lazy person. You know, when it gets cold outside, what do? You sit inside and you put a blanket on and you hang out. And if someone came by you and, you know, set a pizza in your lap, even if you're not hungry, if they're bringing it to you, you might pick it up and take a bite. So that's kind of the theory when you're punching, is you're trying to get that bait right in front of them and get them to react. Yeah. You know, if the pizza's across the room and you're not hungry, you're not going to get up and go get it. And even if it's dropped in your lap, sometimes you're not going to take a bite because you're not hungry. And I feel like a lot of times with this, you know, if you're flipping in there and you're feeling them bite it real quick and letting it go, that's typical of high pressure days. Either the conditions are wrong or the timing's wrong. You know, that goes back to the moon. Big thing that I pay attention to is the solar lunar tables, where it tells you a minor and a major feed time. You know, a lot of people don't pay attention to that. But for me, I've noticed over the past 4 or 5 years that it really does make a difference. If you know, say this is our best area right here, you know, through experience of practice or coming through here. If you know this is your best area and you come through it and you're not in a minor or a major feed time and you don't get bites, don't get discouraged. You know, go back through it during the major feed time and see what happens. You know, because these fish don't eat all day. Bass don't eat all day. They eat when the opportunity presents itself or when that time comes. If you've ever watched a bass at a fish tank, you know, you could put a dozen shiners in the tank with him and right away he'll eat 1 or 2 because he's hungry. But then he'll wait. You know, he won't. It's not like a goldfish that will just eat and eat and eat until he's, you know, overfed. A bass is a predator. He knows that exactly how much food he needs to maintain, and they don't want to exert a lot of energy under conditions like this. They're going to be more apt to sit still and wait for the food to come to them. That goes for when it's either really hot or really cold. You know, the bass is able to slow down its metabolism based on the conditions outside. Old timers used to say when it's just on the horizon is the minor feed type. So if that's going down, we're getting close to a minor. And when it's directly overhead is the major, or directly underneath you, which is 12 hours apart from each other. That makes sense. You know, if the moon, to make it easy, just say if the moon is directly over your head at 12 o'clock, which that changes every day, but if it's directly over your head at 12 o'clock in the middle of the day, it's going to be directly underneath you at midnight. And it's going to be on the horizon at 6 or 3 and 9, something like that. I always just look the table up. It's a lot easier. It changes an hour every day though. So say if your major feed time yesterday was 11 to 12, the next day it's typically going to be from 12 to 1. This goes into what we were talking about earlier, how there's stuff out in front of us and we're making a lot of noise and chopping this stuff up. I don't think that helps. Yeah, I like this a little better. There's not all that junk cut up floating out in front here. So for the setup here on the reel, guys, you know, like I said, with the rod, it's 7-11. Typically I go 7-8, 7-10, 7-11, something over 7-6 to give you a little more leverage on those fish. But with the reel, this is just a 7-4 gear ratio. So it's on the higher end of the ratio. You know, they make them anywhere from 5-1 up to 9-1 on bass reels typically. But I'll stay in the 7 range, you know, 7-1, 7-2, 7-3, depending on what brand you go with. They make different gear ratios. But what this is going to allow you to do, it's still fast enough to where you could get in and out pretty efficiently. You know, with a 5-to-1, you're going to be turning a lot more to get it up and out and back in. And an 8-to-1, you're going to lose that low end torque, meaning when you flip in there and you hook a big fish, you know, this drag, the drag is non-existent. We don't use drag for this. It's locked all the way down. So you're not going to be able to turn that reel handle as much because the torque changes. You know, like a lower gear rate, the lower the gear ratio, the more torque you're going to have. The higher your gear ratio, the more speed you're going to have. Now, if I'm casting a bait like a frog or something that you're reeling on top, or a buzz bait, I'll go with an 8-to-1, 9-to-1, because you're just, you know, when they eat it, they're out in the open. You don't need that low end torque to pull them out of this. Same with the line. This is 65-pound P line. We're not catching 65-pound fish, but it's a torque aspect. You know, you go down to 40, 50-pound braid, it's rated for 40, 50 pounds, but at 10 yards, when you swing as hard as you can, it shocks it. You know, you could put more than 40 pounds of pressure on that line on the hook set. So if you're having trouble when you're setting the hook and the line's popping, if it's just breaking, that's probably because you're too small on the line. And if you're having trouble getting the fish out, you know, because you're using an 8-to-1 or 9-to-1 reel and it feels like you're turning the handle and nothing's happening, try the 7.4, 7.2, and that's going to give you the best of both worlds with being able to get in and get out and have the torque to get the fish out. I got a feeling we're going to catch a big one here soon. Just the frequency of the bites has been more than what I expected already, so I feel like we're coming up on that prime time. Another thing to pay attention to, like right here I have an opportunity to hit that spot behind these cattails, but what I'll do is I actually wait until the boat goes past it, because if you do get one in there, you want to pay attention to your path out. You know, now if I get him, he's going to come straight out versus me having to bring him over those cattails. So kind of pay attention to that too, guys. If you're getting a bite, or if you go a long time without a bite, don't get lazy and stop paying attention to how you're going to get that fish out. That's really critical before you make the pitch, to decide, okay, if I flip it in there, am I behind something? Which sometimes you can't help but be behind something, but knowing that ahead of time is going to allow you to catch more fish. Like in this case, there's some little sticks and stuff in here. I want to get it around those, but I don't want to go over this stick right here, because then, you know, you're going to have to get that fish up and out of the cover and over that stick, and your percentage goes way down. With the water dropping, what you're looking for a lot of times is something with a nice edge like it is here, you know, because there's water back in there. And here a month ago, there was 4 foot of water on this stuff on the outside and 2.5 foot of water on the stuff back in. But now that it's coming down and it's only about 2.5 foot deep out here, you know, you've got maybe 6 inches of water under that stuff way in there. So it's naturally going to pull those fish out to the edge. But if I come across a spot that looks like this, I'm always going to go inside. Just because if you look back there, it's just a perfect little pond with that lettuce in it. And I've got somewhat of a clear path to get them out. Check the depth. It's about 1 foot deep. And with it being that shallow right there, you know, 1 or 2 flips in that spot's typically going to be enough. But since it's so much shallower back there, typically they're going to be right on the edge. For me, it's important. I know a lot of guys still use hand control trolling motors, and that's fine. Um, but I like a foot control because I'm able to keep my hands on the rod all day. You know, I'm able to be ready as soon as it goes in to set that hook. Whereas a hand control, you're turning it, then back up, turning it. So, I mean, not everybody's going to have access to this. If you have a foot control or a hand control trolling motor, you know, just be aware that you should probably steer before you make your flip. You know, if you're trying to steer and pitch this stuff, it happens so quick that you got to be ready. You know, this is like basically an extension of my foot. I don't even look really to see, you know, at first when you first start using these, you'll have to look down to see where you're facing, but after you do it for so long, you just get the feel for it. That's the other thing. You don't see a lot of tips on this because it's not really what we're after, but when you get hung up with this big weight, you know, if you go to pull it out and it's not coming, don't start snatching over your head. It's not only is it dangerous, but it tears up more baits. So say I'm hung up here, all I'll do is I'll point the rod straight at it and pull it out. That's going to be the safest way to get it back to you and the most efficient way to get it back to you without tearing up the bait. You know, I've had guys get on the boat and they constantly, you know, because your natural instinct as a bass fisherman, every time you get hung up, you could typically shake it off. Not in this presentation. If you start shaking it overhead and it comes flying out, this thing basically becomes a projectile. So always pull it straight back towards you. With 60, 65, 70, 80 pound braid, it's either going to break the grass, or if it breaks the line, you weren't going to get it back anyway. So that's the most efficient way to get it back out of that stuff without causing any problems for yourself or dinging up your gel coat. It's a little bit shallower right here. If you give a guy a bass rod and a worm, I mean, you could catch a bass. You know, bass overall are fairly easy to catch when you're considering the big picture. But if you're looking at, you know, being the most efficient and catching the biggest fish every single day, day in and day out, that's where the small details really come into play. You know, in your mental game, like knowing that, hey, it might take 25 pounds to win today. So, you know, that's where it comes in to, okay, I've got a place that I could go catch 10, 12 pounds. It might take me 2 hours, but I catch 10 or 12 pounds. But in reality, that's not going to matter at the end of the day. So you might have to make a decision to do something like what we're doing here, where you might go 5 hours without a good bite, and then you catch 3 in 30 minutes, you know, 3 8-pounders. And knowing those techniques and those patterns and having confidence is a big thing. You know, you see a lot of bass guys come off kind of arrogant, and it's just because, you know, in order to do this day in and day out and be good at it, you have to be confident in what you're doing. You know, and that's, if you're just out starting to do this technique, that's why I mentioned earlier that you're not going to get a ton of bites. You know, don't get discouraged just because you go out 2, 3, 4, 5 times and you don't get a bite doing it. You know, there's a reason why you're not getting bites. If you figure that reason out, you know, the only way you're going to figure that out is trial and error. You know, you can listen to someone tell you how to do it all day long, but until you go out and apply it and it works for you, you're not going to have the same level of confidence as a guy who's done it for, you know, 10, 12 years. And he knows that any given pitch could be an 8-pounder. That's why I try to simplify everything else that I can. The stuff that I can simplify, the colors, the bait shape. You know, I'm not going crazy on the bait shapes. I'm not changing to a bigger, smaller. I'm not constantly changing. You know, I know this works, and it's more about being in an area and getting your bait in and out more efficiently than it is, you know, can he see your line? You know, some guys get worried about the line losing a little bit of color. You could take a permanent marker as this braid starts to lose its color. If you really feel like that's making a difference, you can take a permanent marker and paint it black, and it goes back to, you know, just as good as new. Because with braid on a reel is going to last a lot longer, especially if you don't do it a lot. This line will last, you know, the average fisherman a whole year on a reel, and you don't want to throw it away if it's still good. So if you just wanted to color it up, a permanent marker is a good way to do that. There's actually a couple companies that make permanent markers for braid. They charge like 20 bucks for a permanent marker.
Sharpie's not one of them.
Right.
Even though it works.
If you see like these big mounds of mud like that, all that stuff is from the hurricane that came through a couple years ago, or a year ago now, where it took the areas that had muddy bottom like this and it literally just ripped it up. Where we're fishing right now, used to look like what it does back there. It was just a really thick wall of cattails, and it's all opened up now because of that storm. So if you look across here to the other side, it was about half this distance. Actually, where those cattails are at used to be the edge that looked like this. And that's the other thing about fishing in Florida is grass changes, you know. Just because you go to a spot and catch fish that day, you know, if you don't go back out for a month or 2 months later, you know, that changes. It changes on a daily basis. Anytime you're fishing vegetation, whether you're in Florida, you know, Alabama, anywhere that has vegetation, you got to be able to read that grass the right way in order to determine, you know, if it's worth fishing or not. Like this right here, in my mind, this is getting too shallow. We should probably crank up and go down a little bit. But if you didn't know that, you know, you would spend that time wasted and not being productive. Notice how I'm skipping a lot of that. You know, it just looks like I'm not hitting everything like I was earlier, just because there's not as much of that blowing in grass. The hyacinth and the water lettuce, like a mullet. So the main difference between like flipping a bait like this, flipping a punch rig, versus, you know, if you're a guy that lives up north where you flip down a bank, you're flipping a jig or something, a lot of this stuff there, you know, you're flipping underneath trees, underneath docks, so the presentation is more of a slide along the surface, a skip, if you would, versus, you know, when you're fishing grass or mats or cattails or everything, the presentation is up and over. So that's what a lot of people have a hard time adjusting to when they come and do this, and they say, well, we flip all the time back home. You know, we pitch jigs and stuff, we could do that, but getting that motion to where it's down and up and back down is what's strange. You know, it's just, there's not very many places in the world that you could go and do this, and so a lot of people don't do it. It's like an airboat went through there or something. Right now, it's more about just having a canopy over them because of the high pressure. But as it gets colder, that's something to, you know, keep in mind. You want to find those places that are protected from the wind, because that wind blowing through is going to keep the water tips down. Florida bass are notorious for not biting during cold front conditions. Like the Florida strain in general just doesn't like cold fronts. You know, there's some places that we go where the colder the better. You know, the fish actually, because they have winters, you know, where it snows, and as it first starts getting cold, it's like their natural instinct to start feeding for the winter. But here, you know, it doesn't stay cold for very long, and the water's typically shallower. So, you know, these fish will kind of hunker down for a day or two, and then eat 2 or 3 days later when it warms up. But they, you know, I just think it's because they don't have that long duration of winter like they do elsewhere. But cold front conditions, post front conditions in Florida, probably the toughest bass fishing scenario that you could be put in. Even on a lake that's known for giant fish, you know, if they're not going to bite, there's only a few things you could do to put yourself in the right scenario. You know, if you had access to deeper water, which on Okeechobee you really don't, you know, maybe back it off and fishing some deeper stuff. Look at that alligator. Look at that. See what he's doing? That's a big one too. That's what the bass are doing up underneath there. They're just laying there getting the sun. That's a big boy. Good night. Probably not going to catch one right there. You know, if you go down through here and don't have any bites versus a place where you got 5 bites, you know, typically that's going to be, there's a reason for it. And so far I've seen why, because this stuff isn't as good. You know what I mean? It doesn't have that stuff blown in as good as it did back there. There's probably still fish underneath it, but you can't get underneath that stuff. There's nowhere to get, you know, down.
So you gonna throw back in there?
Yeah, I never hooked them. You know, if you flip in there and you don't hook the fish, sometimes you'll have a chance. A lot of times you spook them though. You know, he's still hanging around there, but he's probably gonna be a little spooky now. But I mean, that one on the way down, it just knocked slack in the line. He hit it so hard, I thought there was no way he didn't have it. Ideally, what you really want to do if you flip it in there and you think you've had a bite, you know, go ahead and get in a position to get it tight and then set the hook, but it caught me off guard. The other ones have just kind of tapped it a little bit. That one flat out slammed it. There he is. So I'm gonna hold it here for a second and you let it go. Dang. See, now when you do like that, you wish you set the hook quicker. Feels small. He just tapped it. Oh! When I set the hook, he didn't feel small. Golly. That one hit it like a little tiny fish. Just nonchalant. What it is, a big one sitting there. Just mouthing it. Because when I set the hook, I felt the shoulders on it. He's probably not going to bite now. Just the fact that I could come back and get him to bite again is pretty, it's positive. It tells me that they're biting better. But I mean, literally that time when he bit it, if you didn't pick up, you would have never known that you would have had a bite. Like there was no tap or thump or anything. He was just holding it. He's probably not going to bite again now. They don't want any company when they're spawning. When they're pre-spawn though, they'll get, you know, that fish will have his section of the map, but he might be there and there might be another one right here. You know, but when they're up underneath this stuff, they're pretty much finding a spot that they like, and if other people come or other fish come around, then it's not going to bother them. They're all there for the same reason. But if they're, you know, if they're spawning, they want that nest to themselves. They don't want, you can't have 5 or 6 bass on one nest. Yeah, the longer the grass has been there, the better. You know, if you come through here one day and there's nothing here, and then the next day it looks like this, and you know it just got there. You know, most of the time it's had to, you know, be there for a month, 3 weeks, a month before they're going to start using it. Because if it's, you know, if it's gonna move on them, they're not gonna hold in it. You know what I mean? Like if it's constantly moving, which this stuff does, those fish aren't gonna want to stay in it. They want something that's gonna be locked in that. And that's why I said from the beginning that it's important to have that vertical cover, because that's what holds it in there. You know, it's where that cattail keeps that mat locked in that spot no matter what the wind does. Like this stuff right in here, you can see it's actually growing into the cattails. You'll start out and you might not be getting any bites, and then you'll start getting a few bites but missing them. And then you'll go from, you know, get a few bites and miss it up to everything you hook is, you know, even the ones we hook were just, you know, an inch inside their mouth, and then you'll start noticing that they're actually getting it. And that's what tells me, you know, when the bite's starting. How do you know they're getting more aggressive? Obviously the frequency of the bites is important, but how they get it tells you a lot too. So there's the crayfish that's native to Florida is blue, like this. If you look it up, it's just a Florida crayfish, and they're like an electric blue. They're really common, and people buy them for their fish tanks, their aquariums and stuff, because they're really pretty. But that's why a lot of the blues work really good down here, because it's a natural forage for them. You know, black and blue is always a good color in dark water, but sometimes that blue is the way to go. That's why I switched it up, thinking that maybe those fish that are hitting that other bait are a little tentative to it. Maybe they'll hit something with a little brighter color more aggressively. Yeah, just because it's so unique to this area, and Okeechobee really made it famous. You know, I get guys that come here in July and August and, yeah, we want to go punch. It's like, dude, you don't punch then. Like, well, we watch it on YouTube, you know, so-and-so was punching, that's what we want to do. And it's like, you don't just punch all year long, you know what I mean? You got to have the right scenario. These fish don't live underneath this stuff year round. You'll have little ones that will, you know, resident fish, but not the big ones that we're looking for. And as much as they spray everything now, I mean, it really keeps them moving. It seems like they'll wait. It's almost like these guys know where you're fishing. You know what I mean? Like you'll find a stretch where it's just really good, and tournaments coming up, and you'll get ready to go out, and then all of a sudden it's dead because they came in and sprayed it. When they have, you know, all this stuff way back in there that they could spray, but yet they come right down the edge where you're fishing and kill it. So technically, which nobody that bass fishes refers to it like that, technically this is a pitch, right? When you pitch it out like that. And a flip is when you leave your reel locked and do like this. So it's pitching and flipping is the terminology for it, but you know, everybody really refers to it as flipping. The clothesline or the closed reel presentation, you know, that was when it first came around, you know, and you could get closer to the fish.